Okay, great. So, and I'm going to share my screen in a minute. So, I really don't like sharing my screen because then I can't see all of you when I'm talking. And I don't know, somehow talking into the void. It just doesn't, it's hard to see how people are responding. Whereas when I can see your faces, I have a sense. So please ask questions because I can't tell. And Sandy, you can start now. Go ahead.
You can see us, can you? The little scenes of us?
No, because you're seeing my screen. Otherwise, I just have a little, it's so small that, and it shows up on the screen. It's so small that it's not
Well,
helpful.
did you go to if you go to view,
Yeah.
I guess you're in if you're seeing the gallery. Well, you're a speaker, but you should see, because when Yitzhak teaches, he always sees little things of the students while he's teaching.
Well, we will see. Um, I won't go to I won't go to speaker view, and maybe that will help.
Right, gallery view, you would be able to see everybody.
All right. Well, let's get to it. Chapter 4, and let me put up the screen. Yes, I do see you sort of to the side. That's great. Thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome.
Yes, you see each other, or at least some of you. Okay, so, and it happened when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Oh, that's not going to work. Because let me see. Oh, no, it does work. Okay. All right. And it happened when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan. The Lord said to Joshua, take for yourselves one man from the people, to take for yourselves from the people 12 men, one man for each tribe, and charge them, saying, carry from here, from the Jordan, from the place where the feet of the priests stood firm, 12 stones, and bring them across with you and set them down at the encampment where you will spend the night tonight. So from this perspective, they have come through, and now the Joshua is selecting people from the tribes and bringing stones from where the priests stood. And they'll carry them there and they'll set them up. And so Joshua calls them, and one man from each tribe, and he said, cross over before the ark of the Lord God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you will lift one stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes. So this may be a sign in your midst, right? So now we're getting actually an explanation. God didn't give an explanation, but Joshua seems to see an explanation. So should your children ask you tomorrow, saying what, and tomorrow clearly means in the future, not the next day, saying, what are these stones to you? You shall say that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the Lord's covenant. When we crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones are a memorial to the Israelites forever. So this language should be very familiar to you. This idea, should your children ask, and I think if you, let me just verify that, but I think if you look in the Hebrew, yes, the Hebrew is ki yishalun, but when they ask, not if they ask, but when they ask. So the idea is that the children in the future will see the stones and they will say, Maha avanim ha'elu lachem. What are these stones to you? Right, and this should be immediately raising reminders not only of the book of Exodus, but of the Passover Haggadah, right? Remember the so-called wicked child, though he's not at all wicked in the text. Lahem, what is this ritual to you, right?
Yes.
So in other words, what's the meaning of these stones? And the answer, of course, is the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Lord's covenant when it was crossing the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, right? And these stones become a memorial for the Israelites forever. So there, on the bank of the Jordan, we'll have this memorial. And your descendants will ask, what are those stones? And they will be told this story. Now, in a sense, and we're going to see this again and again, what we have here in this account, we saw it a little bit in chapter 3, we're going to see it in chapter 4, are echoes to the beginning of the Exodus, right? So, at the beginning, the waters split. At the end now, as they enter the promised land, again, the waters are going to split. At the beginning, you had a ceremony that would, for generations, be able to remind them of the Exodus. And here you'll have something that generations will be reminded of the end of the Exodus, the entrance into the promised land. So they're sort of bookmarks on one end and of the other end of the wilderness journey. Right, here we are. The people hurried and crossed over. And it happened when the people had finished crossing over, the Ark of the Lord and the priests with it. Oh, I just want to point out also that the nation, I think should your children ask, right? There is a kind of, where is it? The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Lord's covenant when we were crossing over. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, right? Notice the kind of repetitive, the waters of the Jordan were cut off when we crossed, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. You can hear this almost poetically as a kind of song, right? A refrain. It's giving it a certain cadence. There's a certain feeling to the response, perhaps also emphasis, right? Right, the waters were cut off. Like at the sea, they have met this impasse. And like at the sea, the waters will split. Okay, so thus did the Israelites do as Joshua had charged them, and they carried 12 stones as the Lord had spoken to Joshua. According to the number of tribes, they brought them across to the encampment, set them down there. And now we get something else. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests, bearers of the Ark of the Covenant, had stood. And they have been there to this day. So there's no indication that God told him to do this. Unlike the other stones, where it was very explicit, God told Joshua, Joshua told the people did it. Here, Joshua seems to be creating a different kind of memorial on his own to mark the exact spot within the Jordan where the priests stood. And, remember that the Jordan, at the time that they cross it, is at flood. But otherwise, it's a pretty shallow river. And you could imagine these rocks kind of sticking up in the middle of the Jordan, and later generations who come to see it. And these are essentially pointing towards this 12-stone memorial, right? So Joshua, it's almost like an arrow, this way. This is the way we came. This is the spot where we came. These are the places where the priests had their feet, the priests who were carrying the ark. This is where they stood, right? So it's very dramatic, and it's there for all time to remind people. And Joshua spoke to the people. All the mission that the Lord charged Joshua to speak to the people was finished, as all that Moses had charged Joshua. Now, we don't have any indication that it seems like God had spoken directly to Joshua. And this idea, just as Moses had charged Joshua, unclear really what it means, because we don't have that in the text. And we don't really know what Moses said. It seems very unlikely that Moses knew or gave details of the crossing to Joshua. There was some talk in Deuteronomy, as you probably remember, of setting up stones. There were supposed to be stones at the entrance to the land and so on. But these stones are very different. They have a very different function. There's in the case where Moses is commanded to do this, they're going to write the commandments on the stones. So, like a mezuzah when you enter the house, so they'll be there. People will know what the laws are. We don't have a sense of that here at all. So it's puzzling what it means when it says that Moses had charged Joshua. The people hurried and crossed over, and it happened when all the people had finished crossing over, that the ark of the Lord with the priests on it crossed over before the people. And this is the tribe of Reuben and Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle array before the Israelites, as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000 vanguard of the army crossed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. So just to remind you of the story from the book of Numbers, there had been this earlier conquest on the other side of the Jordan. These 2.5 tribes said that it was beautiful land. They want to stay there with their wives, their children, their flocks. And Moses tells them, after intervening with God, he tells them, okay, but you go forward as the vanguard. You'll be the shock troops, and you'll be able to return. So here in this procession, we're seeing exactly what they promised to do, and they're doing. They are out in front. Now, the number 40,000 is a bit strange, because 2.5 tribes consists of way more than 40,000 people. And so there are various commentators have various ideas about this. You might remember in Deuteronomy that we saw some military exemptions. So perhaps there were many exemptions. Perhaps some of these men stayed behind in order to protect these areas which had been conquered, where their families were continuing to reside. It's really unclear. But for whatever reason, it says there were 40,000. On that day, the Lord made Joshua great in the eyes of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. So here we get a sense, the word fear here is really not a great translation. Yirah means more a sense of awe and reverence. In other words, acknowledging him as the legitimate leader, having a reverence for him, that he has now achieved this goal of being accepted by the people, now as the legitimate heir to Moses in leadership, and somehow leading them through the sea, having shown this miracle, which Moses had also done, seems to have reinforced now this idea. And Joshua has the acceptance of the people now as their legitimate leaders. Okay, and then God said to Joshua, charge the priests, bearers of the Ark of the Covenant, that they come up from the Jordan. And Joshua says, come up from the Jordan. And it happened when the priests, bearers of the Lord's covenant, came up from the Jordan, within the Jordan, that the priests' foot soles pulled up dry ground, and the water of the Jordan went back in their place, flowed as in time past over its banks. So the picture here is that they stayed in the Jordan until the entire people had passed through. And then as they themselves now at the end pass through, the waters close over. And the people had come up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal at the eastern edge of Jericho. And these 12 stones that they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. Okay, so the first month in the Bible is the month of Nisan. It is the month of Pesach, right? Pesach. And so and this also gives us a sense of symmetry. They left in Nisan, they come back, they achieve the goal of their journey in Nisan. And we're going to see that it's more than that. Pesach will very soon be an important part of this narrative. And again, we get this language. When your children ask fathers tomorrow, that is, in the future, saying, what are these stones? Right? This is a slightly different relation. For them saying, on dry land, Israel crossed over the Jordan, for your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before them until they crossed over, as the Lord had done at the Sea of Reeds, which God dried up before us until we crossed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, right? So again, these stones now memorialize this passage, and the purpose here, which we're getting now for the first time, is exactly like the purpose of the Exodus, that the knowledge of this will spread throughout the world, and all the peoples of the earth will know that the hand of the Lord is strong, so that you may fear the Lord your God at all times. Okay. I'm going to pause my share since we finished chapter 4. And I welcome your questions or comments on these ceremonies and their connection back to the Exodus or anything else. Sandy, yes?
Yeah, thank you. This is pretty far-fetched, but I'm just wondering, the stones, and they use the word memorialize. Is that of anything? I'm just thinking, when you go someone goes to the cemetery and, you put stones, if it has anything to do with.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's not really clear why we put stones on a grave. I have a theory, but I mean, we now have these monuments, or placards. But in antiquity, I'm sure they didn't. So how did they mark graves? They had a pile of stones, I think. And so this is kind of grave maintenance. It's kind of come down to us generation after generation. And in some sense, the purpose has been lost, the original purpose. But like many things in Judaism, things, even when the original purpose is no longer necessary, rituals tend to continue on. And I think we find new meaning in them. I mean, there is a desire when you're at a grave to do something,
Right.
make some connection, to do an act, just in the same way that we light a yard candle, right? We want to symbolize this fact that we remember people. And so having something to do at the cemetery seems meaningful, even if perhaps the original meaning is no longer operative. And again, I speculation as to where it came from. Anything else about, yeah, Saul?
I think you might have talked about this already, but why did they have to dry up the Jordan? Because as you said, it was probably low and people could walk across it.
Yes. So there is an explanation back in chapter 3 that simply says it's a flood, right? That the Jordan does tend to flood. There are times when it does. Remember that, this is coming down from the mountains. There are times of flood. It's a little awkward because the flood generally takes place earlier, not in Nisan, but and of course part of it is, if you think about it also, if it's really flooded and really deep, so it's not clear how the priests managed to get into it and stand. But I think the emphasis here, the memory here, is really about, as I was saying, a crossing at the beginning of the Exodus, a crossing at the end, and the language is so that the water becomes a wall, takes us right back to the Song of the Sea, right? So a lot of this, what you have is Joshua doing miracles, or not doing them, but effectuating miracles that Moses did. This again is, he's the new leader. He becomes accepted as the new leader. He's not on the same level. And in a sense, you could say Moses had the sea, Joshua only had the Jordan, right? There is a sense here. Joshua is described as a servant of God. Moses is more than simply Eved, a servant. He's the one who talks to God as one person talks to another. So there's a clear difference. Joshua is no Moses, yet he does on a smaller. You see this later on in the book of Kings with Elijah and Elisha. So Elijah is the great prophet. Elisha is his protege. When Elijah is about to depart this world, he gives his mantle. This is like the mantle of leadership. He gives it to Elisha, and then Elisha performs in small scale some of the miracles that Elijah did, right? So that the mantle of power comes with the ability to do things, but not quite as well. Not on the sort of scale that the predecessor was able to do them. Other comments, questions before we go on with the next chapter? Okay, so we are going to go on with the next chapter, and I will once again share my screen. Okay, so chapter 5. And it happened when the Amorite kings who were across the Jordan to the west, and the Canaanite kings who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan before the Israelites until they crossed over, their heart failed. There was no longer any spirit within them before the Israelites. This is exactly like what happened to the people that they had passed through. This was, we were just told, one of the reasons for this. So it's fulfilled in a way that everyone should know the power of God. And now we get this command. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives, and again circumcise the Israelites a second time. So Joshua is commanded now to have the people circumcised and to use flint knives. Now, we're already, in terms of technology, we're in the Bronze Age. It certainly, they don't need to use flint knives, but there is a sense that, this is a traditional implement. And you think about people who are perhaps conservative. Why do we continue to read Torah from a scroll? Right? We could produce books, we can mass produce them. Scrolls are extremely inexpensive. We have better technology, but we follow tradition. We do it the way our ancestors did it. And there's a very enigmatic scene where Moses, when he is returning to Egypt to go before Pharaoh, there's a scene where he seems to be attacked and he is circumcised, and that seems to ward off the attack, and it's a flint knife. So, okay. And the question then is, well, why weren't they circumcised? Why does the whole people need to be circumcised? Okay, and this is the reason that Joshua was circumcised. Them all the people who had come out of Egypt, all the males, the men of war, had died out on the way in the wilderness when they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way when they came out of Egypt were not circumcised. 40 years did the Israelites go into the wilderness until the whole generation was finished. The men of war coming out of Egypt who had not heeded the Lord's voice, as the Lord vowed to them not to show the land, vowed to them not to show them the land which the Lord had vowed to their fathers to give, a land flowing with milk and honey. Right, so this again is a reference to the mission of the scouts, the mission which led to the people's rebellion against God and a generation not entering the land. So people who left were circumcised, and there's actually a wonderful midrash about the fact that they were circumcised in Egypt. According to this midrash, the Egyptians came to them and they said, "Why are you circumcising your sons? We're just going to drown them in the sea anyway." What's the point of this? The boys are going to die. And they said, "Nevertheless, we circumcised them. Right? We will follow God's command." That again is not in the Torah, it's a midrash, but I think it's a midrash that may even be responding to this text to make it very clear that they were circumcised in Egypt. Now, why is it that they didn't circumcise in the wilderness? And the text gives no answer. Commentators speculate that the nature of the journey in the wilderness was such that they couldn't. They were always, they had to be ready to march at a moment's notice. They didn't know where they were going. Suddenly, one day, the cloud would lift over the Mishkan, and it was time to go. So under those circumstances, they are unable to do this. They don't want to be left behind. Remember that we have a sense that it's going to take several days in order to recover. We have that very famous story about Dinah, who was taken captive, and her brothers Shimon and Levi go in and to rescue her, and they fool the people of Shechem, and they tell them that yes, they'll intermarry with them, but they have to be circumcised. And when they're circumcised, and this is days later, they take advantage of it. Shimon and Levi take advantage of it, and they go in and they slaughter them, and they take Dinah. So from that story alone, you have a sense that they had to keep moving, and that is the Jews in the wilderness, and they would need recovery time. But, that's one piece of speculation about this, because the truth is, we don't know. The Torah doesn't tell us. Okay, so when do they do this? So first of all, the Lord said to Joshua, I have rolled away from you the shame of Egypt, and the name of the place has been called Gilgal to this day. So the question is, what is the shame of Egypt? Well, first of all, why is it called Gilgal? So Gilgal can mean a number of things, but one of them is a circle, like a wheel, like something that can be rolled. It also can mean a mound, and we're going to see that also here. But these are kind of attempts to creative etymology to kind of understand the meaning of this name. So what is the shame of Egypt? Well, one theory is it's simply slavery, that now they're free. They have come to the land, their own land, where they are finally completely free. And the other is that it is a place where that there is a shame in being uncircumcised, and that God has rolled away that shame. And they encamp at Gilgal and performed Pesach, the Passover rite, on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. So here, we not only didn't have circumcision, we also didn't have Passover, right? And it's not coincidental that the two are related, because according to the text in Exodus, no one who is uncircumcised can take part in the Passover Seder, the Passover ritual, right? So in order to celebrate Pesach, they had to be circumcised. There it says it quite explicitly. It says that the slaves in your home can take part only if they're circumcised, right? So why circumcision is a prerequisite for celebrating Pesach, not entirely clear, but it is one way of sort of identifying that you are part of this covenanted people. And so, again, we have this sense what happened on the eve of the Exodus now happens on the conclusion of the Exodus, at the end of the journey. And then they ate from the yield of the land from the day after the Passover sacrifice, flatbread, parched grain on that very day. And the manna ceased on the day after they ate from the yield of the land. The Israelites no longer had manna. They ate from the produce of the land of Canaan, right? So we've really made it. Now, the food of the wilderness, no more. They are eating from this land that God has given to them. And the process has essentially now, they become free people in their own land, surviving on that land. And then we get, I just love this little scene. It happened when Joshua was at Jericho. He raised his eyes and saw, and look, a man was standing before him. The Hebrew is v'hine. There's a sense of suddenly, he's what? A man is standing before him, and he has his sword in his hand. And Joshua goes to him and he says, Halanu ulitzarenu. are you with us, one of us, or one of the enemy? Right? And this man says, lo, I am not. Right? Are you with them or with us? No. Right? I am not part of that. Right? It is not a zero sum, although it's going to turn out he is with them. But the point is that he is not actually human. I am the commander of the Lord's army, and I have come. Right? So this idea that we've already talked about Adonai Ish Milchama, that God is a warrior. But here we get something more than that. We have a sense, God is called Adonai Tzvaot, which we often translate as the Lord of hosts. But it's clear that Savaot is part of the root, it's Savah, right? And you know that in Israel, that's what the army's called, right? So this is, when we talk about the Lord of hosts, we're really talking about the God over God's armies. And we have a sense that there is a being, an angelic being, who is the commander of that. And he is here to talk to Joshua, who is the commander of the Israelite army. And I've come, he's there now on the eve of the first battle that the Israelites are going to fight. And Joshua falls on his face to the ground, and he says to him, what does my master say to his servant? So this sense of, prostration, we saw it with Moses. We see this as a way of, and he says, I'm your servant. And the commander of the God's army says to Joshua, take your sandal off your foot. The place where you stand is holy. Again, the alarm bell should be going off. This is exactly what God said to Moses at the burning bush. And what God, the burning bush, is to give Moses instructions that he needs to proceed with the Exodus, that he should go back from Midian, go to the land of Egypt, go to Pharaoh, say, let my people go, and all of that. So once you see, it's really stunning how with the Passover, we've actually, in some ways here, if you think about this as a poetic structure, we have A, B, C, and then C, B, A, right? First, we have at the beginning of the Exodus, the first thing that happens is take your shoes off. God is speaking, right? And then we have Passover. And then we have the splitting of the sea. And now here, we're working our way back, right? So that not the first thing, but the last thing becomes the analogy to Moses at the very beginning. Okay, skip these notes. Okay, so now we're going to see it. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Here it comes, right? So Jericho was shut up tight before the Israelites. No one came out, no one went in, right? So this is, they know what's coming. God's renown, and this was what Rahab, right, the prostitute, had told the scouts who came out in chapter 1. We're terrified of you. We all know what was done. So the Lord says, and I think this is what it says, the Lord said, this is really God's message by means of God's general. See, I've given into your hand Jericho and its king and the mighty warriors, right? You'll defeat them. And now what are the instructions? Go around the town, all the men of war, encircling the town once. This you will do for 6 days. Right? And not only that, 7 priests will bear 7 ram's horns before the ark. And on the 7th day, you will go round 7 times. 7 priests, 7 days, right? And 7 priests, 7 days, 7 shofrots, right? So 7 and 7 and 7 and circles and all of this, right, reminds us in some ways of creation, which took place in 7 days. There is a sense of wholeness and harmony, which is also construed by 7. And there's also some magic here, right? That there's a kind of incantation. And also it must be terrifying to the inhabitants of Jericho. Remember, this is the whole army. And they're marching around and around every day. And then to the 7th day, where they're going to go around 7 times, and they're blowing the shofar. So they can see it from the walls, they can hear it. And the shofar is a military horn. It's a way of calling troops. I mean, we have all kinds of other associations with it, particularly on Rosh Hashanah. And one of my favorite explanations of why we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and there are at least a dozen of them, but one of my favorites is that it is a battle cry. And we are going to war on the high holidays, but the enemy is also ourselves. That we are fighting with ourselves to overcome our sins, to be better people. But here, it's clearly not that. The context is a military one. And so you blow the ram's horns, and when the horn of the rams sounds a long blast, and when you hear the sound of the ram's horn, right? This is the Tekiah Gedola, right? At the end, all the people will let out a great shout, and the wall of the town shall fall where it stands, and the people will go up, every man straight before him. Right? So those are the instructions. The walls, don't worry, you don't have to breach the walls, they're coming down. And Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, bear the Ark of the Covenant, 7 priests will bear 7 ram's horns. And he said to the people, cross over, go around the town, the vanguard will cross over before the Ark of the Lord. And it happened as Joshua spoke to the people that the 7 priests bearing the 7 ram's horn before the Lord crossed over and blew the ram's horn with the Ark of the Lord's covenant going after them. And the vanguard was going before the priests who were blowing the ram's horn, and the rear guard was going behind the ark as they went and blew the ram's horn. So here it's in the middle of the people. And Joshua had charged the people saying, you shall not shout or let your voice be heard, and no word shall come out of your mouths until the moment I say shout, and then you will shout. So you have, I mean, just imagine this scene. Right? They're walking in silence, all of them. The shofrot are blowing, but they are not saying anything. And the Ark of the Lord went round the town, circling it once. They came back to the camp and spent the night. Joshua rose early in the morning. The priests bore the Lord, the 7 priests, the ram's horn before the Lord, went along blowing the ram's horn. The vanguard going before them, the rear guard going after them, the Lord, and they went blowing the ram's horn. They went around the town once on the 7th day, returned. So they did for 6 days. And it happened on the 7th day that they rose early as dawn broke. They went around the town in this fashion 7 days. Only on that day did they go around 7 days. And it happened when the priests blew the ram's horn for the 7th time, that Joshua said, shout, and the Lord has given the town to you, and the town that all there is shall be put under the ban to the Lord, except Rachav, right? The whore, the prostitute shall live, and whoever's in her house. For she hid the messengers who we sent. Now, it's not entirely clear how this works, right? Because after they go through it, the walls fall down. Now, Rahav was supposed to put the red string in her window on the wall. So how do they see the red string? How do they know where Rahav is? And so the commentators struggle with this. And they say, well, it wasn't the whole wall. There was a wall left standing. After all, you don't have to breach the entire thing. As long as you have plenty of room to go in, you're okay. But it does seem to be somewhat of a contradiction. She hid the messengers who we sent. Only you must keep from the band, lest you covet and take of the band and put the camp of Israel under the band and stir trouble. So this is a reference to the cherem, this idea that people are not supposed to take any booty, any plunder, and that all the inhabitants are to be slaughtered. I'm going to come back and I want to talk about that next time. I want to get into it. This time we're going to actually see a scene where it's violated, and that would, I think, be the right time to talk about it. All the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron shall be holy to the Lord. They shall enter the Lord's treasury. And the people shouted and blew the horns. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the ram's horn, they let out a great shout, and the wall fell down where it stood, and all the people went up into the town, every man straight before him, and they took the town. And they put under the ban everything that was in the town, men, women, lad, elder, ox, sheep, and donkey, to the edge of the sword. And the two men that had spied out the land that Joshua has said, go into the house of the whore woman, bring the woman out from there, and all that is hers, as we vowed to her, and so on. I just want to, before we move on, just point out this is all happening on the seventh day, right? So if you think about creation, right, the seventh day is the end of creation. And this is, in a sense, a kind of undoing of a creation. That is the walls of the city. And so there is a sense in which 7 days is perhaps here also significant. Rahab is to be, we'll talk about these spies in a minute. And these are the guys who had spied things out before. And so they know her, and they get her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that is hers, and all the clan they brought out, and they put them outside the camp of Israel. And the town they burned in fire and everything in it. Only the silver, the gold, the vessels of bronze and iron they placed in the treasury of the Lord's house. I have to say, this seems very anachronistic. It's really not clear what the treasury is, right? There is no Lord's house there. Later on, we'll have a temple, and the temple will have a treasury. So, I'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but it seems, this whole story, and there are, you might remember we talked about the question of maybe who wrote this, or where it came from, or when it came from. This story, was it written shortly after the time of events? Does it come to us from later in the period of Kings? And this is a suggestion, perhaps, that it is much later. That, because it doesn't quite work here. And Rahab was kept alive, and she has dwelled in the midst of Israel to this day. Right, that is her descendants, right? That her family continues. And you might remember also that one of the commentators says, well, she actually marries Joshua, right? And among her descendants are prophets like Jeremiah. And of course, that she had converted. So she hid the messengers that Joshua sent to buyout, and Joshua imposed a vow at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord who will arise and rebuild this town of Jericho. His firstborn shall found it, and with his youngest set up its portals." Right, so this city, not only have they plundered it, destroyed everything, but the city is never to be rebuilt. And there is a passage in the book of Kings, King Ahab does rebuild the city, and his children die. That this curse somehow he was a very evil king, by the way, but it seems to be fulfilled. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. We have a few minutes left. Questions, comments, if any. Saul.
Rachel gets a lot of publicity here. I mean, she's mentioned in several Pesukim.
Yes, she does. And the scouts get none. We never knew their name. Here they're anonymous also. My theory about this is that she is the first person who embodies the message of the Exodus, that the miracles have happened and that the purpose was the world should know. And she is the first person to testify that the world knows. But however you look at it, part of it is we kept our oath, right? There's that element also, that they have been not only loyal to God, but loyal to her and her family. But yes, she gets a lot of play. Other comments, questions, Sandy?
So, Rabbi, the Lord's house, it's not referring to the ark?
No, you couldn't possibly put all of this gold and silver and everything else inside the ark.
Okay.
I mean, you're talking about a lot of stuff.
I see. All right, thank you. And also,
Yeah.
can I ask you one more? So when they went around 7 days and they blew the shofar, I guess they could blow it on Shabbat?
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning that, actually. No, there is a sense, right? And that's probably the seventh day, right? And so it's Shabbat. When they blow it for 7 times on the seventh day, I think, certainly commentators say this, it's Shabbat, right? And they're going to go in to fight, right? That on Shabbat. But I think the idea here is, they're fulfilling God's command, and there are certain things that override Shabbat, and this is one of them. It's worth mentioning that one of the reasons why the Maccabees succeeded was that those who were before them, who sought to battle the Greeks, were just waited out, because the Greeks knew Shabbat came, they weren't going to fight, and they would go and they would slaughter them. And so the Maccabees said, there's a verse, Eit lasot ladonai hifiru toratecha. It is time to act for God, nullify the Torah. Right? There is a sense in which exigent circumstances can lead, and we know this, for example, about healing on Shabbat, right? That you can do whatever you have to do for someone who is seriously ill. So I think that's sort of the rationale here, and it's striking that in another military context, and this was a great innovation of the Maccabees, and they were, after all, religious fundamentalists, right? You would expect for the Maccabees in particular, violation of Shabbat would be, abhorrent. And yet, it's time to, right? It's time to do God's bidding and nullify temporarily, nullify God's command. Anything else? Yeah, so.
Yeah, I wanted to mention the words "v'chavash lufa b'yado" in the very previous chapter from the Tsar Tzava Adonai. Harvashlu Fav Yado also appeared in the Parshat Balak
Yes,
the,
yes.
with the Aton,
Yeah, that's great.
the Malach.
Yeah. Didn't see it. Thank you. It's great. Anything else? Oh, yes. Gretchen?
So if it says that Jericho can never be built again, but it exists now,
Right,
so what happened?
right. It exists now, but I would, first of all, this is a vow Joshua makes. Um, it, it doesn't mean that, it's not God saying this city can never be rebuilt. Right? A. B, Joshua, it is Jericho, which, is one of the oldest cities on earth and was conquered and rebuilt and conquered and rebuilt, never, to my knowledge, had a wall around it later on, right? So the question is, well, what does it mean to be rebuilt and all of that? But it's a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, have a wonderful week. And I will see you, God willing, next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.